I never thought there would come a day when I would have to wipe another woman's spit off my face in my own living room. I certainly never imagined that woman would be my son's wife. And I definitely never thought my son, the boy I raised with every ounce of love I had, would stand there and watch it happen without saying a single word. My name is Magdalena Ward. I am 62 years old, and I have spent the last 40 years working harder than anyone I know to build a peaceful life here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you know Santa Fe, you know the light here is different. It's softer. It heals you. After my husband, John, passed away, this house became my sanctuary. It is filled with things that matter to me, my books, my collection of Pueblo pottery, and the silence that I have learned to cherish. That Sunday started perfectly. It was one of those golden afternoons where the air smells like sage and dust. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, reading, with a cup of tea cooling on the side table. The house was quiet. It was mine. Then, the front door flew open. I hadn't invited them. My son, Marion, and his wife, Sandra, have a habit of just showing up whenever they feel like it. They don't knock. They don't call. They just barge in, bringing a whirlwind of chaos into my calm space. "Mom, we're here." Marion shouted from the hallway. I put my book down, swallowing the sigh that wanted to escape my lips. "In the living room," I called out, forcing a smile onto my face. They walked in, and the energy in the room changed instantly. Sandra didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She just scanned the room with that critical, narrowed look she always has, like she's an appraiser deciding what is worth keeping and what should be thrown in the trash. "It's so stuffy in here, Magdalena," she said, dropping her purse on my clean dining table. "Don't you ever open a window?" "It's perfectly cool in here." "Sandra," I said, keeping my voice even, "would you like some tea?" "No. We actually came because Marion needs to talk to you about something," she said, wandering over to the mantel. My stomach tightened. It was always Marion needs to talk, but it was always Sandra doing the talking. And usually the talking involved money. I looked at my son. He looked tired. He's a grown man, but sometimes when he looks at his wife, he looks like a scared little boy. He wouldn't meet my eyes. While I was looking at him, I heard the scrape of ceramic on wood. I turned my head. Sandra was holding the vintage vase that sits in the center of my mantel. That vase isn't just a decoration. It belonged to my mother. It's fragile, hand-painted, and it's the one thing in this house I have asked everyone not to touch. Sandra knows this. "Sandra, please be careful with that," I said, standing up. She scoffed, turning the vase over in her hands carelessly. "Relax, Magdalena. I'm just moving it. It looks tacky right here in the center. It completely clashes with the painting. I'm going to put it in the corner." "I didn't ask you to decorate," I said, my voice firming up. "I asked you to put it back. That was my mother's." She rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated groan. "God, you are so rigid. You know that? You care more about these old, dusty things than you do about making your family feel comfortable." "I care about respect in my own home," I said. I walked over and held out my hand. "Give it to me, please." She didn't hand it to me. Instead, she slammed it back onto the mantel. Hard. The sound echoed in the room. My heart jumped, terrified it had cracked. "There," she spat. "Happy? You are so controlling. It's suffocating, honestly. No wonder Marion hates coming here." The air left the room. I looked at Marion. "Is that true?" I asked him, "Do you hate coming here?" Marion shifted his weight, looking at the floor. "Mom, come on. You know how she is. You are being a little intense. It was just a vase." He was doing it again. He was rewriting reality to keep her happy. He was throwing me under the bus to avoid a fight with her. "It is not just a vase," I said, my voice shaking now. It is my home. And if you cannot respect my things and respect me, then maybe you shouldn't be here. Sandra stepped into my personal space. She was close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, which I probably paid for. Her face was twisted in ugly anger. We shouldn't be here, she hissed. You selfish old witch. We are the only family you have. You should be begging us to be here. I will not beg for respect, I said quietly. And then it happened. Sandra pursed her lips and spat. It hit me right on the cheek, just below my eye, wet, warm, degrading. I froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. I stood there, in the home I paid for, surrounded by the things I loved, with my daughter-in-law's saliva sliding down my skin. I waited. I waited for the explosion. I waited for Marion to grab her arm, to yell, to kick her out. I waited for my son to protect his mother. I looked at him. He saw it. He saw exactly what she did. And he just sighed, running a hand through his hair. Mom, he groaned. See what you made her do. Why do you have to push her? You know she's sensitive. My heart didn't break. It shattered. It wasn't the spit that hurt the most. It was that. See what you made her do. I looked at Sandra. She was smirking, challenging me to scream, to fight back, to give her the reaction she wanted so she could play the victim again. She wanted a war. She wanted me to yell so she could tell everyone how crazy I was. So I did the one thing neither of them expected. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a tissue, and slowly, deliberately wiped my face. I folded the tissue and put it back in my pocket. I didn't frown. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I looked Sandra dead in the eye, my face completely blank. Then I looked at Marion. I looked at him until he had to look away in shame. And then I turned around. Mom. Marion called out, his voice sounding a little nervous now. Mom, where are you going? I didn't answer. I walked out of the living room, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. I walked up the stairs one step at a time, listening to them whispering frantically downstairs. Is she calling the police? Sandra whispered. I don't know, Marion hissed back. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I stepped inside. I closed the door. And I turned the lock. Click. I leaned my back against the door and slid down to the floor. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was mine. I sat there in the semi-darkness, listening to the blood rushing in my ears. They thought this was just another fight. They thought I would come downstairs in an hour, apologize for upsetting Sandra, and cook them dinner like I always did. They thought I was weak because I loved them. But as I sat there on the floor, staring at the photo of my late husband on the nightstand, I realized something. I had been weak. I had allowed this. But the woman who wiped that spit off her face, she wasn't weak. She was done. I checked my watch. It was 4 p.m. I had until morning to decide the rest of their lives. And as I sat there, I realized I wasn't crying. I was planning. The lock on my bedroom door made a solid, heavy click. It was a sound I hadn't really noticed before, but today, it sounded like a border being drawn. I stayed on the floor for a long time. My cheek still burned. I touched the spot where she had spit on me. It felt dirty, like a stain that wouldn't wash off with just water. I finally pulled myself up and walked over to the vanity. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had this morning. My eyes were red, but dry. I washed my face, scrubbing that spot on my cheek with soap until the skin turned pink and raw. I wanted to scrub away the feeling of her disrespect, but I knew soap wouldn't fix what had just happened downstairs. I walked over to the nightstand and picked up the framed photograph of my husband, John. He's been gone for 5 years now. In the picture, he's wearing his work boots and a dusty t-shirt standing in front of the frame of this very house. We built this life from scratch. We ate beans and rice for years so we could save every penny. We sacrificed vacations, new cars, and fancy clothes so that our son, Marion, would never have to struggle the way we did. I traced John's face with my thumb. I made a mistake, John. I whispered to the empty room. We made his life too easy. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I realized that Marion standing there, silent, while his wife assaulted me, wasn't a sudden change. It was the result of a lifetime of cushioning. When he failed a test, I blamed the teacher. When he couldn't afford his first car, we bought it for him. When he lost his first job, I sent him a check to cover his rent so he wouldn't feel the sting of failure. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought love looked like protection. But sitting in that quiet room, I realized I hadn't protected him. I had crippled him. I had raised a man who didn't know the value of $1 or the weight of respect because he had never been forced to earn either. He stood by his wife not because he agreed with her, but because he was weak, and she knew it. Just then, a sound drifted up through the floorboards. It was the television. I stiffened. I walked quietly to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear the familiar hum of the Sunday football game. Then I heard the refrigerator door open and close. The clatter of silverware on plates. They were eating. They were downstairs in my kitchen, eating the roast beef I had prepared this morning. They were sitting on my couch, watching my television, drinking my wine. They weren't packing their bags. They weren't huddled together, discussing how to apologize. They weren't worried at all. They were comfortable. A cold wave washed over me, replacing the shame. They assumed I was just upstairs, pouting. They thought I was an old woman having a tantrum. They believed that if they just waited me out, I would come downstairs tomorrow, apologize for being rigid, and write them a check for whatever they needed next. They were banking on my love being stronger than my dignity. For the first time in my life, they were wrong. I stepped away from the door. The sadness in my chest began to harden into something else. It felt like iron. I looked around my room. The comfort, the peace, the security. I owned all of this. Every beam in the ceiling, every tile on the floor. And yet, I was the one hiding in my bedroom while the people who disrespected me made themselves at home downstairs. No more, I said aloud. My voice didn't shake this time. I walked over to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. I pulled out my address book. I didn't need to look up the number. I knew it by heart, but seeing the name written in John's handwriting gave me strength. Thomas Richardson, estate attorney. It was Sunday evening. I knew Thomas would be at home, probably having dinner with his own family. I hesitated for a second, wondering if I was being too rash. Then I heard Sandra's laugh float up from the living room. It was a loud, cackling laugh. I dialed the number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. Magdalena! Thomas's voice was warm, surprised. Is everything all right? It's been a while. Hello, Thomas, I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. I'm sorry to disturb your Sunday evening. Not at all, he said. What's going on? You sound serious. I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning, I said. 7 a.m. sharp. There was a pause on the other end. Thomas has been our lawyer for 30 years. He knows how I operate. He knows I don't make emergency calls for social visits. 7 a.m., he repeated slowly. Is this about the estate plan? Yes, I said. I need to make changes. Significant changes. And I need you to bring the paperwork for a full revocation of the current trust. Magdalena, he said, his tone shifting to his professional lawyer voice. Did something happen? Is Marion okay? Marion is fine, I said, looking at the closed door. Physically, he is fine. But the son I thought I had is gone. I need to protect what is left of my life. Thomas, can you be here? I'll be there, he said. Do you want me to come to the back door? So I don't wake anyone? No, I said. Come to the front door. Ring the bell. And Thomas, wear your best suit. I want this to be official. I understand, he said. I hung up the phone. My hand was steady. I walked to my closet and laid out my clothes for the morning. I chose a crisp white blouse and my black trousers. I wasn't going to come down in a bathrobe. I wasn't going to look like a victim. When I walked into that kitchen tomorrow, I wanted to look like the owner of the house. I could still hear the TV downstairs. Let them enjoy the game. Let them eat the roast beef. Let them think they have won. They had no idea that while they were watching football, I was rewriting their future. I turned off the light and got into bed. I didn't cry myself to sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of my son and his wife enjoying my hospitality, and I waited for the sun to come up. The morning couldn't come fast enough. I didn't sleep much, but when I got out of bed at 5:30 in the morning, I felt more awake than I had in years. There is a specific kind of energy that comes from knowing exactly what you are going to do. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was clarity. I went downstairs quietly. The house was still. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the settling of the floorboards. I tied my apron around my waist, the clean, starched one I usually save for holidays, and I got to work. I pulled the heavy cast iron skillet from the cupboard. I took out a package of thick-cut bacon, a carton of eggs, fresh berries, and the expensive pancake mix I usually save for when the grandkids visited. If I had any, I ground the coffee beans myself, letting the rich, dark aroma fill the kitchen. I wasn't cooking out of love. I was setting a stage. I knew my son. I knew Sandra. They operated on the path of least resistance. If they woke up to a silent house and a cold kitchen, they might feel awkward. They might pack their bags and leave before I could talk to them. But if they woke up to the smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee, their greed would override their shame. They would assume I had capitulated. They would think, see, Mom is back to normal. She just needed to sleep it off. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted their guards down. By 6:45, the kitchen looked like a magazine spread. A stack of golden pancakes sat in the warming oven. The bacon was crisp. The fruit was cut into perfect little cubes. I set the table for 3, but I placed 4 chairs. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. Then came the heavy thud of footsteps. Marion came down first. He was wearing his pajamas, scratching his stomach, looking sleepy and soft. When he saw me at the stove, his shoulders visibly relaxed. He let out a breath he must have been holding since yesterday. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Wow, smells amazing in here." He didn't mention the spit. He didn't mention the argument. He just saw the bacon and decided everything was fine. "Good morning, Marion," I said. I didn't smile, but I didn't scowl either. I kept my face neutral, busy flipping an egg. "Coffee is ready." Sandra came down a moment later. She was wearing a silk robe that I knew cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She walked in, sniffed the air, and smirked. It was a small, victorious little smile. She looked at Marion as if to say, "I told you she'd get over it." "Is there orange juice?" she asked, pulling out a chair. "No, hello." "No, sorry about yesterday. Just a demand." "In the pitcher on the table," I said, placing the platter of bacon in the center. They sat down. The tension that had been choking the house yesterday seemed to have evaporated for them. They piled food onto their plates. Marion poured syrup over his pancakes. Sandra took a large sip of coffee and sighed contentedly. "This is good, Magdalena," Sandra said, picking up a piece of bacon. "I'm glad you're feeling better. Yesterday was just a lot of unnecessary drama, don't you think?" We're all family here. My hand tightened on the counter, but I didn't react. Family, I repeated softly. Yes. I mean, really, Marion added, his mouth full. We just need to communicate better. Sandra has been under a lot of stress, and you know how you get with your rules, Mom. But this. He gestured with his fork. This is nice. Let's just reset. Reset. As if he could just hit a button and erase the image of his wife spitting in my face. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:59 a.m. I agree, I said, wiping my hands on a towel. We do need to reset. In fact, I've invited someone to join us for breakfast to help us with that. Marion stopped chewing. Who? Neighbors? Sandra asked, looking annoyed. Magdalena, I'm not really in the mood to make small talk with your garden club friends. Ding dong. The doorbell chimed. It was sharp and loud in the morning air. Marion frowned. Who comes over at 7 in the morning on a Monday? I'll get it, I said. I walked to the front door. I could feel them exchanging confused glances behind me. I opened the door, and there stood Thomas Richardson. He looked immaculate. He was wearing a charcoal gray three-piece suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silver tie. He held a thick leather briefcase in his left hand. He didn't look like a neighbor. He looked like an executioner. Good morning, Magdalena, he said, stepping inside. I believe I'm right on time. Right on time, Thomas. Thank you. I led him into the kitchen. When Marion and Sandra saw him, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The cozy warmth of the breakfast vanished. Marion dropped his fork. Sandra stiffened, pulling her robe tighter around herself. Mr. Richardson? Marion asked, his voice rising in pitch. He knew Thomas. Everyone in town knew Thomas. He was the man you called when someone died, or when you were suing someone. He wasn't a breakfast guest. Hello, Marion, Thomas said. His voice was deep and gravelly, with zero warmth. Sandra. What is going on? Sandra asked, looking from me to the lawyer. Why is he here? Please keep eating, I said, gesturing to the empty chair at the head of the table, the spot where my husband used to sit. Thomas has already eaten, haven't you? I have, Thomas said. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, looming over them. He placed his briefcase on the table, right next to the platter of pancakes. The click-click of the latches opening sounded like gunshots in the quiet kitchen. Marion pushed his plate away. Mom, what is this? I stood by the sink, leaning against the counter. I crossed my arms. Well, I began, my voice steady. Yesterday, Sandra called me old and rigid. She said I was controlling, and it got me thinking all night. I realized she was right. Sandra blinked, confused. I was... Yes, I said. I have been too rigid about holding on to the past. And I have been too controlling by trying to protect you two from the real world. So, I decided to update my affairs this morning to reflect a new, more flexible reality. Thomas opened a red folder. He pulled out a document that was stapled at the top. Magdalena has authorized me to make immediate changes to her estate plan, Thomas announced. He didn't sound like a friend now. He sounded like a judge. Effective immediately, the standing monthly transfer to Marion Ward's account has been canceled. Marion's jaw dropped. What, Mom? I have a car payment due on Thursday. Thomas ignored him. Furthermore, he continued, Magdalena has revoked the clause in her will that granted you residency rights in this property. This house is solely in her name. You have no legal claim to it. You can't do that. Sandra shouted. Her face was flushing red. We live here. We're family. Thomas turned his head slowly to look at Sandra. He lowered his glasses. Actually, Mrs. Ward, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, we can, and we are. Under New Mexico state law, Assault against an elder family member is considered a serious offense. We generally refer to it as hostile conduct. The room went dead silent. Assault. Sandra sputtered. I didn't hit her. It was just an argument. Spitting, Thomas said, enunciating the word clearly, is considered battery. It is a form of assault. It is degrading. It is unsanitary. And in the eyes of the law, it is an act of violence. Sandra's face drained of color. The red flush vanished, leaving her skin looking like paste. She looked at me, then at Marion, then back at Thomas. She realized for the first time that I had told him everything. Now, Thomas continued, smoothing the paper. Magdalena has chosen, graciously, I might add, not to file a police report this morning. However, she has classified that interaction as gross ingratitude. This allows her to legally disinherit you completely without fear of the will being contested later. Marion looked like he was going to be sick. He looked at his pancakes, which were now cold and soggy. Mom, he whispered, you're disinheriting us. Over a vase. It wasn't about the vase, Marion. I said, and it wasn't even about the spit. It was about the silence. Your silence. I walked over to the table. I picked up the pitcher of orange juice and poured myself a glass. My hand was perfectly steady. Thomas has the new paperwork, I said. He is going to explain what happens next. I suggest you listen very carefully. The free ride is over. The Bank of Mom is closed. I took a sip of the juice. It tasted sweet. Sandra was gripping the edge of the table, so hard her knuckles were white. She looked at me with pure hatred, but also with fear. Genuine fear. She looked at the bacon, then at the lawyer, and she realized the trap she had walked into. She thought she was waking up to a victory breakfast. Instead, she was waking up to her own eviction. You have a decision to make, Thomas said, pulling out a pen. And I suggest you make it before you finish that coffee. I watched them. I watched the realization sink in. They weren't the powerful, modern couple putting the old woman in her place anymore. They were two children who had just been told that recess was canceled forever. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like the matriarch. Go ahead, Thomas, I said. Tell them the rest. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. It was the kind of silence you usually hear in a hospital waiting room, not at a breakfast table covered in pancakes and syrup. Thomas Richardson didn't seem to mind the tension. He adjusted his glasses, opened the red folder, and smoothed the document flat against the table. Let's be specific, Thomas said. His voice was calm, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis that he had seen 1,000 times before. Magdalena has been incredibly generous over the last 10 years. However, that generosity has been classified in these documents as conditional support. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, those conditions have been violated. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a bank statement. Item 1, Thomas said, pointing a manicured finger at the paper. The Platinum American Express card, ending in 4509. The one currently in your wallet. Sandra. Sandra's hand instinctively went to the pocket of her silk robe. She blinked rapidly. That is for household emergencies. Groceries. Things for the house. Thomas looked at the paper. I see charges here for a spa day at 10,000 waves. I see a charge for a boutique on Canyon Road for $300. I see a charge for a vintage wine subscription. Are these emergencies, Sandra? Sandra's face turned a blotchy red. She opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't find the words. She looked at Marion, silently begging him to jump in. That card has been canceled, Thomas said, flipping the page. If you try to swipe it today, it will be declined. The bank has been notified that it was being used for unauthorized, non-essential purchases. Marion finally spoke up. He leaned forward, trying to look authoritative, but with syrup on his chin, it didn't work. Okay, fine. Cancel the card. We don't need it. I have my own income. I almost laughed out loud. Income? I thought. Marion made a little money here, and they're doing consulting. But it wasn't enough to cover his truck payment, let alone their lifestyle. That brings us to item 2, Thomas said, ignoring Marion's bravado. The monthly stipend. The transfer of $2,500 that goes into your joint checking account on the 1st of every month. You can't stop that, Marion said, his voice cracking slightly. That's part of the trust distribution. Dad wanted me to have that. Your father wanted you to have support while you built a career. I said. It was the first time I had spoken in 5 minutes. He didn't want you to have a salary for existing. You are 35 years old, Marion. That stipend ends today. Marion looked like he had been punched in the gut. He slumped back in his chair. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was calculating the bills, the cell phones, the insurance, the gym memberships. Without that check, they were underwater instantly. And finally, Thomas said, delivering the final blow, the vehicle, the 2022 Ford F-150 King Ranch. Marion's eyes went wide. He loved that truck. It was his pride and joy. He washed it every Sunday. He drove it around town like he owned the road. The truck is titled to the Ward Family Trust. Thomas explained. It is not in your name, Marion. It is a company vehicle. And since you are no longer an active beneficiary of the trust in good standing, the vehicle must be returned to the estate. You're taking my truck? Marion shouted. He stood up, knocking his chair back. Mom, this is insane. You're taking my truck over a stupid argument. Sit down, Marion, Thomas said. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it made Marion freeze. The title transfer is already being processed. You have 24 hours to hand over the keys. If you don't, we will report it as stolen. That was the breaking point for Sandra. She let out a shriek that made me wince. She stood up, shaking, her face twisted into something ugly. This is unfair, she screamed. This is financial abuse. You are holding money over our heads to control us just because I moved your stupid vase. You are a bitter, lonely old woman who can't stand to see us happy. She pointed a finger at me. We are trying to start a family. How can we have a baby if you cut us off? You are ruining your own grandchild's life before it even begins. I felt a sting in my chest, but it wasn't guilt. It was clarity. She was using a hypothetical grandchild, a baby that didn't even exist yet, as a hostage. Marion tried to play the peacemaker, but it was just another form of manipulation. He walked around the table and tried to put a hand on my shoulder. I shrugged him off. Mom, listen to me, he said, dropping his voice to that soft, wheedling tone he used when he wanted money. You're overreacting, okay? Sandra is emotional. You're emotional. Let's not bring lawyers into this. Just tell him to leave, and we can talk about this like family. You don't want to see me lose my truck, do you? You know how hard I worked on that truck. You didn't work on it, Marion, I said, looking him dead in the eye. You drove it. I paid for it. I stood up. I felt tall. For years, I had made myself small, so they could feel big. I had pretended not to notice the wasted money, the rudeness, the entitlement. I did it because I didn't want to be lonely. But looking at them now, Sandra screaming about fairness while wearing a silk robe I paid for, and Marion begging for his truck like a teenager, I realized I would rather be lonely than used. Thomas is not leaving, I said calmly, and neither are you. Not yet. I walked over to the window and looked out at the garden. My roses were blooming. They needed pruning. I had neglected them lately because I was too busy worrying about Sandra's moods. Here is the new reality, I said, turning back to face them. You have a roof over your head for exactly 1 week. 7 days. A week. Marian asked, for what? To find a job, I said. To find a way to pay rent. If you want to stay in this house, you will pay rent. Market rate. That is $1,500 for the master suite you are currently occupying, plus a share of the utilities. Rent. Sandra laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You want to charge your own son rent. This is not a punishment, I said. I looked at Marian. This is an education. You have forgotten how the world works. You think respect is optional because the checks keep clearing. Well, the checks have stopped. So now you have to earn your place. And if we can't pay? Marian asked. He looked terrified. He knew deep down that he couldn't pay. Then you leave, I said. Thomas has the eviction papers drafted. They are dated for next Monday. If you do not have a job and a rent check in my hand by Sunday night, the sheriff will be here on Monday morning to escort you off the property. The room fell silent again. The smell of the bacon had turned greasy and heavy in the air. The pancakes were cold. Thomas closed the red folder. The sound of the heavy cover snapping shut felt like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. I will leave you to discuss your options, Thomas said. He picked up his briefcase. He looked at me and gave a small, respectful nod. I'll see myself out, Magdalena. Thank you, Thomas, I said. He walked out. The front door clicked shut. I looked at the two of them. Marian was staring at the table, looking like a ghost. Sandra was breathing hard, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit or a weapon. 1 week, I said. I suggest you start looking at the classifieds instead of watching football today. I untied my apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Then I walked past them, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the back door to my garden. I had roses to prune, and for the first time in years, I didn't care if they were happy. I only cared that I was free. You can learn a lot about a person by how they handle the word no. Some people take it as a challenge to work harder. Others, like my daughter-in-law, take it as a signal to change tactics. I expected Monday to be filled with frantic job searching. I expected to see Marian circling ads in a local paper or polishing his resume at the kitchen table. I expected Sandra to be on her laptop looking for administrative work or anything that would bring in a paycheck. Instead, the house went quiet, eerily quiet. For the first 24 hours, they stayed in their room. I assumed they were panicked, or maybe they were just waiting for me to knock on their door and tell them I was bluffing. I didn't knock. I went about my day. I watered my plants. I read my book. I ate my meals alone. By Tuesday morning, the strategy shifted. I walked into the kitchen at 8 a.m., expecting to make my coffee. Instead, I found Sandra standing there. She was dressed, actually dressed, not in a robe, and the dishwasher was humming. She had unloaded the clean dishes and was wiping down the counters. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile, so bright it looked painful. "Good morning, Magdalena," she chirped. Her voice was an octave higher than usual. "I made a fresh pot of coffee. I used your favorite beans. And look, I found those blueberry muffins you like at the bakery downtown." She gestured to a plate on the table. Beside it was a vase of flowers, fresh ones cut from my own garden, arranged somewhat haphazardly in a water glass. "I just thought," she continued, rushing her words, "that we got off on the wrong foot this week. I wanted to do something nice to show you that I appreciate, well, everything." I stood in the doorway, looking at the muffins. 2 days ago, she had spit in my face. Yesterday, she had screamed that I was ruining her life. Today, she was playing the role of the perfect housewife. Thank you for the coffee, I said, walking past her to get a mug. I also folded the laundry that was in the dryer, she added, following me like a puppy. I noticed your towels were in there. I made sure to fold them the way you like, with the edges tucked in. I poured my coffee, black. I turned to look at her. That's very helpful, Sandra. Thank you. She waited. She was waiting for the thaw. She was waiting for me to say, "Oh, honey, thank you so much. Let's forget about the rent." "So," she said, leaning against the counter, twisting her wedding ring. "Marion is upstairs getting ready. He's really stressed, Magdalena. He didn't sleep at all last night. He's so worried about disappointing you. He should be worried about finding a job," I said, taking a sip. "Has he sent out any applications?" Sandra's smile faltered for a second, then plastered back on. "Well, he's looking. But you know how the job market is right now. It takes time. And, well, I wanted to talk to you about that. About the stress." She took a step closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Magdalena, you know we've been trying," she said softly, "to get pregnant." I stiffened. I knew they had mentioned it vaguely in the past, usually when they wanted money for a romantic getaway, to help the process. "I know," I said. "Well," she sighed, placing a hand on her stomach. "Stress is terrible for conception. My doctor said I need to be in a calm, supportive environment. And this eviction threat, it's just so toxic for my body. If I don't get pregnant this month, it's basically because of this situation." I looked at her hand on her stomach. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was using a child that didn't even exist yet as a shield. She was trying to make me feel like a murderer of her future happiness. "Sandra," I said, setting my mug down, "let me be very clear. Bringing a baby into a home with no income, no stability, and parents who cannot support themselves is not toxic. It is irresponsible. If you want a baby, you need to be able to buy diapers. And right now, you can't even buy your own coffee." Her eyes narrowed. The mask slipped. "So, you don't care? You don't care if you ever have grandchildren?" "I care," I said. "I care enough to want them raised by adults. Be an adult, Sandra. Get a job." I walked out of the kitchen. I could feel her eyes boring into my back. The nice act had lasted exactly 10 minutes. I spent the afternoon at the library. I needed to get out of the house. The air in there was thick with their resentment, and it was suffocating me. I stayed away for 3 hours, just enjoying the silence of a place where no one expected me to pay their bills. When I pulled into the driveway around 2 p.m., I noticed Marion's truck was gone. He was probably out driving aimlessly to avoid me. But Sandra's car was still there. I opened the front door quietly. I didn't mean to sneak in, but I've always been light on my feet. The house was silent. Then I heard a noise. It was coming from down the hall. From my office. My office is my private space. It's where I keep the bills, the deeds, and the letters from my husband. I had closed the door before I left. It was open now. I walked down the hall, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stopped at the doorway. Sandra was sitting at my desk. She had pulled out the bottom drawer, the one where I keep the legal files. She was rifling through the papers, frantically flipping through the folders. She had the red folder Thomas had left yesterday open on the desktop. She was reading the new will. She wanted to know if I was bluffing. She wanted to see if I had actually signed it. She was checking the dates, checking the signatures, looking for a loophole. I stood there for a full minute, just watching her. She looked desperate. She looked greedy. And in that moment, any tiny lingering hope I had that this was just a misunderstanding vanished. "It's signed and notarized, Sandra," I said. She jumped so hard she nearly knocked the lamp off the desk. She spun around, clutching the papers to her chest like a caught thief. I wasn't. She stammered. Her face went white, then red. I was just looking for a stamp. I needed a stamp. In the legal file drawer, I asked, at the bottom of the stack. She dropped the papers back onto the desk. I have a right to know, she snapped, abandoning the lie. This affects our lives. I have a right to know if you're actually crazy enough to cut us off. You have no rights in this room. I said, get out. You're hiding money, she accused, pointing at the ledger. I saw the numbers. You have plenty of money. You're just hoarding it while we suffer. Get out. My voice was low, but it filled the room. She scrambled past me, running out of the room like a rat scuttling back to its hole. I heard her bedroom door slam upstairs. I walked over to the desk. I organized the papers she had scattered. I closed the red folder. I placed it back in the drawer. Then I picked up the phone and called a handyman service. Yes, I told the man on the line. I need someone to come out today. An emergency call. I need a deadbolt installed on an interior door. By 5 p.m., my office had a new lock. A heavy, brass deadbolt that required a key to enter. When Marion came home that evening, he saw the fresh sawdust on the floor. He saw the new lock on my office door. He looked at me, confused. Mom, why is there a lock on your office? Because I have guests in my house who I do not trust, I said. I looked at Sandra, who was standing at the top of the stairs, watching us. She didn't say a word. She knew I knew. I realized then that the love bombing and the baby talk weren't about fixing our relationship. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was just terrified of being poor. She was scavenging for scraps of control. I touched the cold metal of the key in my pocket. The test was over. They had failed. And I slept with my bedroom door locked again that night, not out of fear, but out of a deep, exhausting disappointment. The clock was ticking. For days left. By Thursday, the air in the house was so thick you could choke on it. We were 4 days into the 1-week ultimatum. 4 days of silence. 4 days of me watching the clock tick down to Sunday night. I hadn't seen a single resume. I hadn't heard a single phone call to a potential employer. Marion spent his time pacing the backyard, aggressively smoking cigarettes. Sandra spent her time in their bedroom with the door shut, presumably sulking or plotting. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on my knitting, when the peace was shattered. The front door didn't open. It exploded inward. Marion rushed in, his face pale and sweaty, holding his cell phone like it was a grenade. Mom, you have to help, he panted, running over to my chair. It's an emergency. A real one this time. My needles stopped clicking. My first instinct, the mother instinct that never truly goes away, kicked in. My heart hammered against my ribs. What happened? Is someone hurt? It's Sandra, he said, his voice shaking. She's stranded on the highway. The car died. She was driving to a job interview in Albuquerque. She was actually trying, Mom. And the car just died. Smoke everywhere. He put the phone on speaker. Sandra, you're on with Mom. Magdalena. Sandra's voice came through the speaker, shrill and panicked. I could hear traffic rushing by in the background. She sounded terrified. Oh God, it was so scary. I almost got hit by a semi-truck. The engine just quit. Are you safe? I asked. Are you off the road? I'm at a mechanic shop now, she sobbed. The tow truck driver took me to the nearest place. But they won't release the car unless I pay for the repairs up front. The transmission is shot, Magdalena. It's completely gone. Marion looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. Mom, she's stranded. She can't get home. And she's going to miss the interview if we don't fix this. How much? I asked. My hand was already reaching for my purse. 2,000, Sandra sniffled. 2,200 to be exact. They said they can fix it right now if I pay cash, but if I don't, they have to impound it. Please, Magdalena. I was trying to do the right thing. I was trying to get a job. Just write the check, Mom. Marian begged. Please. I'll pay you back. I swear. Just don't leave her stranded there. I pulled out my checkbook. I uncapped my pen. It made sense. Cars break down. It was bad timing, but it happened. And she was going to a job interview. Isn't that what I wanted? If I refused, I would be the villain who sabotaged her efforts to be responsible. I wrote the date. October 14th. I wrote the name. Cash. I moved my pen to the amount line. Then I stopped. My eyes drifted to the hallway. I saw the fresh brass lock on my office door. The lock I had to install because Sandra had been rifling through my private papers just 2 days ago. A cold prickle of suspicion crawled up my neck. $2,000 was a nice, round number, and Albuquerque was an hour away. If she was stranded, why did she sound like she was indoors? Mom. Marian urged, "What are you waiting for? She's crying." Sandra, I said into the phone, keeping my voice steady. "Which mechanic are you at?" There was a brief pause. "What? Why does it matter?" "It's just a shop. Joe's. Or Jim's. I don't know, I'm panicked." "Read me the name on the sign." I said, Hold on, she stammered. "It's Midtown Auto Care." I knew Midtown Auto Care. It wasn't in Albuquerque. It was 10 minutes from my house, right here in Santa Fe. "Okay," I said. "Stay there." I closed my checkbook and capped the pen. "Mom," Marian shouted, "what are you doing?" "You have to wire her the money, or I have to run it over there. She needs the check." "I am not giving you a check," I said, standing up, "and I am not wiring money to a stranger." "You're going to leave her there?" Marian looked at me with genuine horror. "After everything, you're going to leave your daughter-in-law stranded at a mechanic shop? That is cold, Mom. That is evil." "I am going to call the shop," I said, walking to the kitchen phone. "If the transmission is blown, I will pay the mechanic directly over the phone with my credit card. I want to speak to the mechanic." Marian grabbed my arm. Not hard, but desperate. "Mom, don't embarrass her. Just give me the money. Why do you have to control everything?" "Let go of me, Marian," I said. He let go. He looked sick. I dialed the number for Midtown Auto Care. I knew the owner, Bob. He had serviced my Buick for years. "Midtown Auto, this is Bob." "Bob, it's Magdalena Ward," I said. I watched Marian pacing in the kitchen, biting his nails. "Magdalena, good to hear from you," Bob said. "How's the Buick running?" "The Buick is fine, Bob. I'm calling about my daughter-in-law's car. The red Honda Civic. She's there right now." "Yeah, she's here," Bob said. He sounded confused. "She's in the waiting room." "Bob, I need the truth," I said. "She tells me the transmission is blown, and she needs $2,000 to get it running. Is that accurate?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then Bob let out a dry chuckle. "Transmission?" Bob said, "Magdalena, the car runs fine. I just drove it into the bay. There isn't a single thing wrong with the engine." My stomach dropped. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ill. "Then why is she there, Bob? Why is she asking for $2,000? "She's here for a quote," Bob said. "She wants to order a set of custom rims and those fancy low-profile sport tires. The total came out to $2,100 with labor. She told me to print up the invoice so she could show her husband." I closed my eyes. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't a repair. It was vanity. She wanted fancy wheels to impress her friends, and she was using a fake crisis to trick me into paying for them. "Thank you, Bob," I whispered. "Do not do the work. Send her home." I hung up the phone. I turned to look at Marian. He was holding his breath, looking at me with hope. Well, did you pay him? Is she coming home? Sit down, Marian. Mom, I don't want to sit. Sit down. My voice cracked like a whip. Marian collapsed onto a kitchen stool. There is no blown transmission, I said. My voice was trembling, not from fear, but from rage. There was no smoke. There was no near-death experience on the highway. What? Marian blinked, but she was crying. I heard the traffic. She was standing outside the shop 10 minutes away, I said. She went there to buy custom rims and sport tires. She wanted $2,000 for accessories. Marian. She staged a breakdown to swindle me. No, Marian shook his head. No, she wouldn't do that. You must have misunderstood Bob. She was going to a job interview. There is no interview, I said. It was a lie. All of it. She tried to steal from me, and she used you to do it. The front door opened. Sandra walked in. She looked flustered, clutching her purse. When she saw us in the kitchen, me standing like a statue, Marian pale as a ghost, she froze. Did you call the shop? She asked, her voice small. I did, I said. She looked at Marian. She saw the look on his face, the devastation. She realized the game was up. It was, well, the car needs new tires eventually, she stammered, trying to pivot. It's a safety issue, really. And I thought if I was getting tires, I might as well get the good ones. Stop, Marian said. It was barely a whisper. He stood up slowly. You told me you almost died, Marian said. You told me you were stranded. I was terrified. Sandra. I was begging my mother for money because I thought you were in danger. I was stressed. Sandra shouted, throwing her hands up. We need money, Marian. If she wasn't going to give it to us, I had to find a way. I did it for us. You tried to con her, Marian said. He looked at his wife like he was seeing a stranger. You tried to con my mother out of $2,000 for rims? We don't have jobs. We're getting evicted in 3 days. I deserve nice things. Sandra screamed. The mask was completely gone now. Her face was ugly with entitlement. Why should she have all that money sitting in the bank while we suffer? She's old. She doesn't need it. It's selfish. I stood there watching them. I didn't need to say a word. The checkbook was back in my purse. The pen was capped. You have 3 days, I said to the room. I walked past them. Sandra was still screaming about how unfair it was. But for the first time, Marian wasn't defending her. He was just standing there, staring at the floor, listening to his wife complain about not being able to rob his mother. I went to my room and locked the door. But this time, I knew I wasn't the only one waking up. Downstairs, in the silence that followed the screaming, I could feel the ground shifting. Marian had finally seen the greed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Sunday morning arrived with a silence that felt like a held breath. The air in the house was heavy, charged with the kind of electricity you feel right before a thunderstorm breaks. This was it. The deadline. I had told them 7 days ago, find a job, pay rent, or leave. I spent the morning in the kitchen, drinking my tea, waiting for signs of movement. I expected to see boxes. I expected to see suitcases lining the hallway. I expected, at the very least, a frantic energy as they scrambled to figure out where they were going to sleep that night. Instead, at 10 a.m., Sandra walked into the kitchen wearing yoga pants and a sweatshirt. She wasn't packing. She was scrolling on her phone. Do we have any almond milk left? She asked, not looking up. She was acting as if the conversation last week, the lawyer, the frozen accounts, the fake car breakdown, had been a bad dream. She was betting everything on the idea that I was bluffing. She was banking on the fact that a mother would never actually lock the door on her own son. Marian came down a few minutes later. He looked tired, circles under his eyes, but he also wasn't packing. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. We're going to run to that new coffee shop on the plaza, Marion said, casually. Get some lattes. Clear our heads. We'll be back in an hour. I looked at him. You're going for coffee? Yeah, he said, shifting his weight. Just need to get out of the house for a bit. It's stifling in here, Mom. You have until sunset, Marion, I said quietly. He rolled his eyes, a small, dismissive gesture. Yeah, we know. We'll figure it out when we get back. Don't worry. They walked out the door. I heard the click of the lock, then the roar of the engine of the truck that was technically no longer his, but which I hadn't seized yet because I wanted to give him dignity. They were gone. I looked at the clock. 10:15 a.m. They thought they had all day. They thought they could come back, order takeout, and guilt trip me into letting them stay just one more night. And then one night would become two, and two would become a month. I set my mug down in the sink. No, I whispered. I picked up the phone. I didn't call the police. I called the locksmith I had put on standby 2 days ago. Jim, I said when he answered, they're gone. Can you be here in 10 minutes? I'm around the corner. Mrs. Ward, he said. Jim arrived in his van 7 minutes later, while he went to work on the front door, changing the tumblers and installing a high-security deadbolt. I went upstairs. I walked into the guest suite. It smelled like them, Sandra's heavy perfume and Marion's cologne. Their clothes were everywhere. Piles of laundry on the floor, makeup scattered across the antique vanity, wet towels on the bedspread. I didn't throw their things out the window. That's what people do in movies. In real life, you maintain your dignity. I pulled their suitcases from the closet. I started packing. I folded Marion's shirts. I paired his socks. I packed Sandra's silk robes and her endless bottles of expensive face cream. I packed the shoes she had bought with my credit card. I worked methodically, efficiently. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, cold detachment, like a surgeon removing a limb to save the patient. It took me 45 minutes to pack everything. Jim helped me carry the bags downstairs. We set them neatly on the front porch, right beside the welcome mat. 4 large suitcases, 2 duffel bags, a box of toiletries. You okay, Mrs. Ward? Jim asked as he handed me the new set of keys. I will be, I said. Thank you, Jim. He drove away. I went back inside. I locked the new deadbolt. Then I went to the back door and locked that too. I checked every window. The house was sealed. I sat in the chair by the front window, hidden behind the sheer curtains, and I waited. At 11:30 a.m., the truck pulled into the driveway. They got out, holding their paper coffee cups. They were laughing about something. They looked relaxed. They had successfully wasted another morning, confident that Mom would handle it. They walked up the path. Sandra was the first to notice the bags. She stopped halfway up the steps. What the? Marion bumped into her. What's wrong? Then he saw them. His gym bag, her pink suitcase, sitting there on the porch. Is she serious? Sandra scoffed. She packed for us? God, she is so dramatic. Marion walked up to the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his key. He slid it into the lock. He tried to turn it. It didn't move. He frowned, jiggled it, and tried again. Nothing. Mom, he called out, knocking on the wood. Mom, the key is stuck. I didn't answer. Marion, open the door. Sandra snapped. My latte is getting cold. I can't, Marion said, panic starting to seep into his voice. It won't turn. He pounded on the door harder. Mom, open up. It's us. I stood up and walked to the wall intercom system next to the door. I pressed the talk button. The key isn't stuck, Marion. I said. My voice came out clear and amplified through the speaker on the porch. The lock has been changed. There was a silence on the other side of the door. Changed. Marion's voice cracked. What are you talking about? Let us in. You have your things, I said, leaning my forehead against the cool plaster of the wall. Everything is on the porch. I checked the room twice to make sure I didn't miss anything. You kicked us out. Sandra shrieked. While we were getting coffee. That is illegal. You can't do this. Actually, since you never paid rent and have no lease, you are guests, I said calmly, and guests can be asked to leave at any time. Your time was up at 10 a.m. Mom, please, Marion pleaded. He sounded like a child now. Where are we supposed to go? We have no money. We have nowhere to sleep tonight. This was the moment. This was the moment where, for 35 years, I had always caved. This was the moment I would usually open the door, write the check, and fix the problem. Every instinct in my body wanted to open that door. But I looked at the spit stain on my soul. I looked at the fake emergency. From Thursday, I looked at the future, and I saw two helpless, entitled people who would eat me alive until there was nothing left. I love you, Marion, I said. My voice trembled, just a little. I love you enough to let you grow up. This isn't love, he shouted, banging his fist on the door. This is cruel. Cruelty is letting you stay here until you are 40, unable to survive on your own, I said. Go to a motel. There is a budget in on Cerrillos Road. It is cheap. You have enough cash for a few nights if you return the rims you tried to buy. I hate you, Sandra screamed. She kicked the door. I hope you die alone in this big, empty house. Sandra, Marion snapped at her. Shut up. Find work, I said into the intercom. Real work. Not consulting. Not dreaming. Work. And call me when you have a pay stub. Not a promise. A pay stub. I released the button. I watched through the curtain. Marion stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the door, his head bowed. He looked defeated. But for the first time, he was carrying his own weight. Slowly, he turned around. He picked up his duffel bag. Let's go, he muttered to Sandra. I'm not going to a motel, she argued. Get in the truck, Sandra, Marion said. His voice was different, heavier. He didn't wait for her. He walked down the steps and threw his bag into the truck bed. Sandra stood there for a moment, glaring at the house, glaring at the camera she knew was there. Then, realizing she had no other option, she grabbed her suitcase and dragged it down the path. They got in the truck. The engine started. They backed out of the driveway and drove down the street. I watched until the truck disappeared around the corner. The house was silent, but it wasn't the lonely silence I had feared. It was the silence of a storm that had finally passed. The air felt lighter. The pressure in my chest released. I walked into the kitchen. I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I washed the cup. I was alone. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt safe in my own home. The hardest part was over. Now, I just had to wait and see if my son would sink, or if he would finally learn how to swim. The first week was the hardest, not for them, but for me. There is a specific kind of pain that comes with silence. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped, thinking it was Marion begging to come home. Every time a car slowed down outside, I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see his truck. But the phone didn't ring. The truck didn't come. I kept my word. I didn't call him. I didn't check on him. I had to let him fall. Santa Fe is a small town, though you can't hide much here. By the second week, the rumors started trickling back to me. A friend from my book club saw them at the grocery store. She told me they were buying generic brand noodles and arguing loudly in the checkout line about the price of milk. Another friend told me she saw Marion's truck parked at the Budget on Cerrillos Road. That is not a place you stay for a vacation. It's a place you stay when you have nowhere else to go. It's loud, it's dirty, and the neon sign flickers all night long. I imagine Sandra there. Sandra, with her silk robes and her demands for high thread count sheets, sleeping on a lumpy mattress in a room that smelled like stale smoke. I admit, a small, petty part of me felt a grim satisfaction. But the mother in me just felt a heavy ache. Was he eating? Was he safe? By the third week, the news changed. My gardener, a sweet man named Luis, knocked on my back door. He looked hesitant. "Mrs. Ward," he said, taking off his hat. "I thought you should know. Your son, he came by the landscaping yard today. He was asking for work." My chest tightened. "Did you hire him?" "I didn't," Luis said. "I don't have openings." But the construction crew down the road did. They're pouring concrete for a new driveway. It's hard work, Mrs. Ward. Heavy lifting. Hot sun. "Thank you, Luis," I said. Marion had never done a day of manual labor in his life. He had soft hands, as my father used to say. He was a consultant. He sat in air conditioning. The idea of him hauling concrete in the New Mexico heat seemed impossible. But then, 3 weeks and 2 days after I locked the door, there was a knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding of the eviction day. It was a single, solid rap on the wood. I walked to the door. I didn't check the camera this time. I just opened it. Marion stood there. I almost didn't recognize my own son. He was sunburnt. His face was peeling a bright, angry red across his nose and cheeks. He had lost weight. His cheeks looked hollow. He was wearing a t-shirt that was stained with dirt and sweat, and his boots, the fancy leather ones he used to wear to dinners, were scuffed and covered in gray dust. He looked terrible, and yet he looked better than I had ever seen him. "Hello, Mom," he said. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't had enough water to drink. "Hello, Marion," I said. I kept my hand on the doorframe. I didn't invite him in. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't look past me into the cool, clean hallway. He didn't ask for water or food. He just reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was crumpled and slightly damp from sweat. He smoothed it out against his leg with a hand that I noticed was covered in blisters. Some of them were wrapped in cheap Band-Aids that were peeling off. He held the paper out to me. "It's not much," he said. "It's for 3 days of work. Mixing concrete." I looked at the paper. It was a payroll check. It was for $340. "I know it doesn't cover the rent," he said, looking me in the eye. "I know it's not enough to move back in. I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to see a pay stub." I took the check. My hands were shaking slightly. It felt heavier than any check I had ever written him. "Where's Sandra?" I asked. Marion let out a short, bitter laugh. He looked down at his boots. "She's at the motel," he said. "She refuses to leave the room. She told me that if I was a real man, I wouldn't make her live like this. She said I embarrassed her by taking a labor job." He looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of anger. "She tried to leave me, Mom," he whispered. 2 days ago. She packed her bag and drove to her parents' house in Albuquerque. She thought they would take her in. And they sent her back the same night. Marion said they told her they weren't going to support a 30-year-old woman who wouldn't work. So she came back to the motel. Not because she missed me, but because she had nowhere else to go. He shook his head. "You were right. About everything. She didn't love me. She loved the safety net. And the moment you cut the net, she started looking for the exit." "I'm sorry you had to learn that the hard way," I said softly. "I needed to," he said. He pointed to the check in my hand. "I earned that, Mom. My back feels like it's breaking. My hands are bleeding, but I earned it. Nobody gave it to me." "I am proud of you, Marion," I said. He flinched, like he wasn't expecting that. His shoulders dropped an inch. "I'm going to keep working," he said. "I'm going to save up for an apartment. A small one. Just for me. I don't think Sandra is going to be part of that. That is a decision only you can make," I said. "I know," he said. He reached out, gently took the check back from my hand, and folded it carefully. He put it back in his pocket, like it was a winning lottery ticket. "I just wanted to show you," he said. "I'll come back when I have the next one." "I'll be here," I said. He turned around and walked back to his truck. He walked differently. He didn't have that arrogant swagger anymore. He walked with a limp, probably from the heavy lifting, but he walked with purpose. He got into his truck and drove away. I closed the door and leaned against it. I closed my eyes, and finally, for the first time in 3 weeks, I let myself cry. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. My son was dirty, broke, and living in a motel with a woman who hated him. But for the first time in his life, he was a man. The blisters on his hands were the first honest things he had ever owned. And I knew then that he was going to be okay. The rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the foundation. 6 months is a long time in the life of a mother. It is long enough to miss your child, but it is also long enough to see if the seeds you planted are going to grow or rot in the ground. For 6 months, I didn't see the inside of Marion's apartment. I knew where it was, a small complex on the south side of town, near the airport. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't nice. The walls were thin, the carpet was industrial gray, and there was no covered parking for his truck. I knew this because I drove by it once late at night just to see. I saw his truck parked there, next to Sandra's Honda. Seeing those 2 cars parked together in that dimly lit lot told me everything I needed to know. They were still together. They were struggling, but they were surviving. Marion kept his job at the construction site. He didn't quit after the first paycheck. He didn't quit when the winter winds started blowing down from the mountains, turning the concrete mix into freezing slush. He woke up at 5 a.m. every single day. I know this because he called me every Sunday evening, just for 5 minutes to check in. "I'm tired, Mom," he would say, "but the foreman made me a crew lead. I got a 50-cent raise." "That's good, Marion." I would say, "That's progress." Sandra was a different story. For the first 2 months, she did nothing. She sat in that small apartment, waiting for Marion to fix it, waiting for me to break. But when the electricity bill came and Marion didn't have enough to cover it and the rent, reality finally hit her. She didn't get a job because she wanted to. She got a job because she had to. She started working the front desk at a dental clinic. It wasn't a career, it was a job. She had to answer phones, deal with angry patients, file paperwork, and be polite to people she probably thought were beneath her. By April, the silence between us felt different. It wasn't angry anymore. It was just quiet. I decided it was time. I called Marion on a Tuesday. "I'm making a roast on Sunday," I said. "Noon. Bring Sandra." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you sure?" he asked. I don't know if she's ready to face you. If she wants to eat roast beef, she'll be ready," I said. Sunday came. I set the table. I used the good china, but I didn't put out the silver. We weren't all the way back yet. At 11:55 a.m., I heard the truck. I watched from the kitchen window. They walked up the path differently than they used to. 6 months ago, they would have stomped up the stairs, talking loudly, bursting in like they owned the place. Today, they walked slowly. Marion was limping slightly. His back, I assumed. He looked 10 years older, but his jawline was sharper. The softness was gone. Sandra walked behind him. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She was wearing a simple pair of slacks and a blouse that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who knew what it cost to pay for her own shampoo. They knocked. I opened the door. "Hi, Mom," Marion said. He didn't hug me immediately. He waited to see if it was okay. "Hello, Marion," I said. I opened the screen door. "Come in." Sandra stepped inside. She stopped on the doormat and wiped her feet. She wiped them 3 times, checking her soles to make sure she wasn't tracking in any dust. "Hello, Magdalena," she said softly. She didn't look me in the eye. She looked at the floor. "Thank you for having us." "Dinner is almost ready," I said. We sat at the table. The conversation was awkward at first. We talked about the weather. We talked about the price of gas. "Gas is up to $3.50, Marion said, shaking his head. "Cost me $80 to fill the truck this week. I had to pick up an extra shift on Saturday just to cover the commute." "It's robbery," Sandra muttered. Then she stopped, realizing she was complaining. She took a sip of water. "But we made it work. I started taking lunch from home instead of buying salads." I looked at her. The old Sandra would have charged a $20 salad to my credit card without blinking. This Sandra was packing a sandwich to save $5. "The roast is delicious," Marion said, eating with an intensity one hadn't seen before. He ate like a man who was genuinely hungry, not just bored. "Thank you," I said. After dinner, I cleared the plates. Sandra stood up immediately. "I'll help you," she said. "You don't have to," I said. "I want to," she said. And strangely, I believed her. She didn't want to owe me anything. She wanted to earn her dinner. We washed the dishes in silence. It wasn't a warm silence, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 women who had been to war and were now observing a ceasefire. When we were done, we walked back into the living room. Marion was sitting on the couch, looking at the fireplace. This was the moment I had prepared for. Before they arrived, I had done something specific. I had taken the vintage vase, the one Sandra had moved 6 months ago, the one that started this entire war, and I had placed it on a small, wobbly side table right next to the hallway entrance. It was precarious. If you walked past it too fast, or if you swung your purse carelessly, it would fall and shatter. I wanted to see what would happen. Sandra picked up her purse to leave. "We should get going," she said. "Marion has an early shift tomorrow." She walked toward the hallway. She was looking at her phone, checking the time. She brushed past the side table. Her hip bumped the edge of the wood. The vase wobbled. It tipped dangerously to the left. I held my breath. 6 months ago, she would have let it fall. She would have said, "Oops," and blamed the table. She would have watched it break and felt nothing because she didn't pay for it. But today, Sandra froze. Her hand shot out. It was pure reflex. She caught the vase by the neck just before it tipped over. She gasped. She pulled the vase close to her chest, cradling it like it was a baby. Her eyes went wide with panic. She looked at the vase, checking for cracks. She looked at the table, realizing it was unstable. Then, very carefully, she walked over to the mantel, the center of the mantel, where it belonged, and set it down gently. She adjusted it, so it was perfectly centered. She turned to me. Her face was pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That table, it's not safe. I didn't want it to break. It's valuable." She wasn't talking about the monetary value. I could see it in her eyes. She finally understood that things have value because someone worked for them, because someone loved them. She knew what it felt like to work 40 hours a week for a paycheck that barely covered the rent. She knew that if that vase broke, she couldn't afford to replace it. Respect comes from understanding the cost of things. "Thank you, Sandra," I said. Marion stood up. He had seen it too. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in months, he didn't look embarrassed by her. He looked relieved. "We'll see you next week." Marion asked at the door. Next week, I said. Call before you come. We will, he said. I watched them walk to the truck. Sandra didn't complain about the walk. She got in, buckled her seatbelt, and waited for him. I closed the door. I walked over to the mantel and touched the vase. It was cool and smooth. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. They weren't perfect. They were tired, they were broke, and they were a little broken. But they were real. And as I looked around my quiet living room, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't just a bank account to them. I was a person, and that was worth every bit of silence. It has been exactly 1 year since the day I changed the locks. 1 year since I sat in this chair and watched my son's truck disappear down the street, unsure if I would ever see him again. The seasons in Santa Fe have cycled through. The winter snow melted, the spring winds howled, and now the late summer sun is turning everything golden again. My garden is in full bloom. The roses I pruned that day are vibrant and strong. They grew better because I cut back the dead weight. I invited Marion and Sandra over for coffee this morning. When they arrived, the difference in them was undeniable. Marion has calluses on his hands now. He walks with the steady, slightly tired gait of a man who works 40 hours a week on his feet. He is still a foreman at the construction company. He didn't quit. Sandra is still at the dental clinic. She was promoted to office manager last month. She told me about it not with arrogance, but with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She pays for her own manicures now, and she goes less often, but she enjoys them more. We sat on the patio. The air was warm. I poured the tea. Mom, Marion said, taking a cup, why did you ask us to come? Is everything okay? He looked nervous. The last time I summoned them for a formal meeting, they ended up in a motel. Everything is fine, I said. Better than fine. I invited a friend to join us. The back door opened, and Thomas Richardson walked out. Sandra stiffened. Her hand tightened around her teacup. She remembered Thomas. He was the man who had frozen their accounts and threatened them with hostile conduct charges. Relax, I said, noticing her fear. Thomas isn't here to evict you. He is here to finish what we started. Thomas sat down. He placed a folder on the table, a blue one this time, not red. Marion, Sandra, Thomas began, his voice professional but softer than before. As you know, Magdalena's estate plan was significantly altered last year. You were removed as beneficiaries. We know, Marion said quietly. We accepted that. We don't expect anything, Mom. We're doing okay. We're paying our bills. I know you are, I said, and that is exactly why we are here. I looked at my son. He wasn't begging. He wasn't looking at the folder with greedy eyes. He was looking at me. He had finally learned that he could survive without my money. He had found his dignity. Your father left a separate investment portfolio, I explained. It was a long-term growth fund. He intended it for you, Marion, but he made me the trustee. He told me, give it to him when he's ready. For 10 years, I didn't touch it because I knew you weren't ready. You would have spent it on cars and vacations. Sandra looked down at her lap. She knew I was right. The fund has matured, Thomas said. It is a significant sum. Marion shook his head. Mom, I don't want it. I don't want to go back to how we were. I like knowing I paid for my own truck. I like knowing I paid for our apartment. If you give us a pile of money, I'm scared we'll get soft again. I smiled. That was the answer I had prayed for. I'm not giving you a pile of money, I said. I am giving you a partnership. Thomas opened the folder. Magdalena has set up a heavy incentive trust, Thomas explained. It is very simple. The trust matches your earned income. For every dollar you earn from a W-2 employer, the trust will pay you $1. Marion frowned. processing the math. So, if I make $50,000 a year, the trust pays you an additional $50,000. Thomas said, if you work harder and get a raise, the trust pays you more. But, and this is the critical clause, if you quit your jobs, the payments stop immediately. If you stop working, the money stops flowing. Silence settled over the patio. It wasn't a lottery win. It wasn't a free ride. It was a multiplier. It was a system designed to reward effort, not existence. Sandra looked up. Her eyes were wet. You're willing to do that? She asked, her voice trembling. After everything I said to you? After the spit? I forgive you, Sandra, I said. I don't forget, but I forgive. You were lost. You thought money was something you were owed. Now, it is something you build. This trust ensures that you will never be poor, but you will also never be lazy. It rewards the woman you have become, not the woman you were. Sandra began to cry. She didn't sob loudly. She just let the tears fall. It was relief. It was the realization that she didn't have to struggle alone forever, but that her struggle had mattered. Marion looked at the papers, then he looked at me. You're making us partners, he said. I'm making you adults. I corrected. He stood up. He walked over to me. I stood up to meet him. He hugged me. It wasn't the weak, one-armed hug of a distracted son. It was a bare hug. He smelled like soap and sawdust. He felt strong. Thank you, he whispered into my ear. You're welcome, I said. No, he pulled back, holding me by the shoulders. Not for the money. Thank you for the money, obviously, but thank you for kicking us out. Thank you for the motel. Thank you for letting me hit rock bottom. He took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. I was drowning, Mom. I was drowning in comfort. I was a weak man, and I was letting my wife become a monster because I was too scared to say no. You saved my marriage. You saved my life. I reached up and cupped his face, my boy's face, now weathered and lined. I just wanted my son back, I said, and I think I finally have him. They stayed for another hour. We signed the papers. We ate the rest of the cake. When they left, they didn't speed away. They drove slowly, carefully. I walked back into the house. I carried the tea tray to the kitchen. I stopped in the living room. The afternoon light was hitting the mantel. My mother's vintage vase was glowing in the sun, centered perfectly. It was safe. The house was safe. I walked out to the garden one last time. I sat on my bench, listening to the wind in the aspen trees. I thought about the journey. It had been brutal. It had been ugly. There were moments I thought I had lost them forever. But you cannot buy respect. You cannot demand it. You can only rent it for a while, with checkbooks and silence. True respect, that has to be earned. It has to be forged in the fire of no. I took a sip of my tea. It was still warm. I am Magdalena Ward. I am a mother. I am a survivor. And finally, my legacy is secure. If you enjoyed this journey and believe that boundaries are a form of love, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have let them back in sooner, or did I do the right thing? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about family, justice, and reclaiming your life, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Click the video on your screen right now to hear another story about a woman who finally stood up for herself. You won't believe what happens in that one. I'll see you there.